Hello, and welcome to the Whale Hunting Podcast, where we shine a light onto the hidden worlds of money and power. I'm Bradley Hope, and this week I'm joined by Steve Fishman, the legendary journalist and podcaster and host of shows including The Burden and most recently, My Friend the Serial Killer. Welcome, Steve.
Thanks for having me, Bradley.
Obviously, you and I have known each other for a long time. I guess I met you when I was a NYU student, and then I was at one point your tenant as well.
I forgot about
Yeah.
that.
So obviously you had this new show come out, My Friend the Serial Killer. You have a new show or an old show coming out in a couple of weeks, Empire on Blood.
That's actually a director's cut of Empire on Blood. We've got 3 new bonus episodes. So, yeah, we're excited about that.
Excellent. Well, one thing I really loved about My Friend the Serial Killer was it kind of also excavated your past and your history as a journalist as well, which I thought was it was kind of the origin story of Steve Fishman. What did you like when you were going through that? You hadn't been through all of that history in a long time, right? I mean, this is sort of you had to rediscover things you probably forgot.
Yeah, I did. I mean, I went back for decades. So it was excavating a whole bunch of stuff. I mean, a lot of it was incredibly pleasant to excavate. I got on the phone and interviewed my old colleagues, comrades, partners in hijinks. And that was a ton of fun. I mean, none of that got in there. So, we'll put that in the movie version. But um, I would say that otherwise, I had resisted revisiting this time, especially this story, because it's hard to listen to the details somewhat. I think we put it in the right context and in the right measure in the podcast. But when I thought about it and my experience with it, um, there was just something in me that didn't necessarily want to relive that moment, that story, that experience with the serial killer. So I was on the side of the road, and a sedan, like a nice enough car, pulled up, and there's this guy. He had a bit of a drawl.
I proceeded to do certain things that I consider to be necessary in the crime that I plan to commit.
There was a funny thing that I recall. You go to kind of pull up the door handle to get out, and it like didn't catch.
First on this list of items was disconnect the door handle on the right-hand side of the car.
I'm Steve Fishman. In the 1970s, I hitched a ride that changed my life. I was just starting out as a journalist and crossed paths with a local man with a secret.
This guy wants to confess to these murders. Let him confess. Boy, he unloaded, I'll tell you that.
He claimed to be the serial killer next door to me. He lived in my town. A killer who got his victims hitchhiking.
You're a lucky man you're here.
And now I had a connection to him. I'd sat in his car. I hoped this would be my big journalism break.
Was it because you're a little bit cringing to see how you practice journalism in your late teens, essentially, or is it because of the actual kind of weird, kind of scary brush with this guy? Or I mean, what was the resistance about?
Well, it was both of those things. I mean, the brush with death. I don't want to make too much of it because if you're not a victim, you're not a victim. And so I wasn't. I did get a lot of kind of reactions from people that I interviewed when I told them that I'd been picked up by the serial killer. They said, "You're very lucky," and that did give me a moment's pause, and I kind of had to relive that and kind of think about being in the front seat of his car where all the other victims were. Um, and, just kind of calling that up was not a place I wanted to be for a long time. But yeah, also, listen, I was 19 and 20, and I went out to get what I thought and actually ended up being a big story, the kind of foundational story of my career kind of set me on this path. Um, Parenthesis here, sometimes I wish I'd been picked up by an investment banker, who knows if I would have had a life steering the ship of capitalism. Um, be that as it may, I, went out and covered this story the best I knew how, and I reread the 5-part series. And listen, it's really good. I get to a lot of facts. I get a lot of people to talk. There's a lot of angles covered, but my focus was on the systemic issues of trying to rehabilitate and treat people who commit terrible crimes. And at the time that the Connecticut prisons were trying, or actually not trying, to rehabilitate the serial killer, it's important to point out they didn't know he was a serial killer. He'd killed 2 11-year-old boys, but he was in prison for rape. And so my pieces, my series, were really directed at trying to figure out, trying to get to the bottom of why he didn't receive any treatment. And in doing that, it was weird to go back because I elevated this guy, this serial killer, this monster, to a platform where he was like a social cultural analyst of a problem that we all wanted to solve rather than a monster. And frankly, in that role, he was an expert because he was a monster. And my articles kind of put that on his head and made him a victim of an indifferent system. And when I went back and thought about that, it felt to me like I had missed the absolute horror of what went on. And Bradley, as you know, I now have 3 kids, and a couple of them are the age of his victims. And I couldn't help but think about what he did to kids the age of my kids. And so my view is not the view of the 19 or 20-year-old who was ambitious to land a big story. My view was of a parent of 2 kids who are in positions of vulnerability on a constant basis.
Yeah, that's a really interesting point. I guess though there is a big sort of debate in the world of crime, even that's taken place since then till now, about how responsible serial killers are in a sense. There's a real analysis of their underlying mental conditions, and there's arguments that the death penalty doesn't make sense because they don't have as much free will as we're ascribing to them. I guess maybe your younger self was more objective than subjective in a way.
Yeah, I think that's right. I was, objective and looking to, um, you know, understand how the system kind of stands and looks at and treats somebody who comes to prison with a severe, serious, awful crime and actually seeks help. Seeking help in prison against a system, and particularly back then in the 70s, that was really bent on punishment rather than rehabilitation. That's always going to be an uphill battle. But one of the things I discovered in kind of investigating this story was that Robert Carr, the serial killer, had what I call in the podcast a switch. And he would go from a guy who I think sincerely wanted help and sincerely knew that there was a monster inside him, which I think is kind of profound. And if you think about somebody living with the realization, the absolute knowledge that they have within them, not only the capacity, but the desire to go out and rape and kill. I mean, that's a rather profound moment. At the same time, the danger to society is deeply profound. And the idea that somebody like this could be on the loose, it just kind of scares me. And I don't know, but in my more mature life, and again as a parent, I mean, I do wonder if society's resources are best spent trying to contain, rehabilitate, understand a serial killer. As I understand the research, a rapist can be rehabilitated. The recidivism rate can be brought fairly low if a rapist goes through a treatment program. I don't believe that's true for a serial killer.
Hmm.
And in the end, in my podcast, if you follow it, you'll find that Robert Carr does win eventually. And it's important to mention, actually, here that Robert Carr does confess. He's arrested for 2 rapes, and he pulls aside a guard in the courtroom and says to this person, I need to talk to somebody. I need to talk to someone about other crimes. And the guy, who's impatient, I suppose he's heard similar things before, says, yeah, what kind of crimes? And Carr says, murder. And Carr begins to confess to 4 murders that nobody knew were murders. 4 murders for which there were not bodies. Without bodies, it's extremely difficult to prosecute somebody for murder. So Carr could have theoretically returned to the streets at some moment a few years later with the same issues and the same desires, and, as he said, the same overwhelming desire to have what he called a forceful relationship. So there is that about him. He does want to give it up, in a sense, wants to not be the person who's a threat to society. He doesn't have a trial because he pleads guilty, but he has a hearing because he's facing the death penalty. And in Florida at the time, to put someone to death, they had to have a hearing, the death penalty phase. And so that really becomes a trial where he puts on many witnesses, including himself. And the judge eventually does condemn him to tons and tons of time, which in the state of Florida actually means 25 years, and also recommends treatment. Carr gets sent to a treatment facility, and he gets kicked out of that facility because essentially he's not seen as a sincere patient. And they discover in his cell several implements which could be used to escape. So he's a very complicated person, and to kind of go in and try and find his rational self, his true motives, that may be a losing game.
I think one of the things that I really enjoyed, though, is maybe it's because I know the Steve of the 2000s first rather than the Steve of the 70s, but I really can see the early signs of what you became so good at in journalism, which is getting people to talk. And I think there's a kind of intimacy to your style, and do you see that as well when you look at how you handled that? Do you see kind of echoes of that when you did Bernie Madoff and Son of Sam later on in your career?
Absolutely. I listened to those tapes. I have tapes of me interviewing the serial killer in prison. And, there's an approach that's really aimed at getting this person to talk. And it works. And, one of the things that I kind of became good at was getting people who didn't talk to open up. And I think to some extent, certainly later, it was a matter of wearing them down to the point where they said, well, there's like therapy, which kind of was when I knew that I I was kind of near the bullseye. But also, being able to appeal to people to tell their story. Yeah, Bernie Madoff, everybody wanted to get to him at that point, and nobody had. And I begun and undertook this year-long forced march, forced by myself to get him to open up, which involves, like, I wrote 100 letters to everybody in his prison unit. Luckily, back then we had interns to help me. And I finally found a prison fixer to help me get in there. I mean, I think I'm a combination, and I discovered this really with the serial killer, a combination of a kind of relentless and ruthless and personable. And Bradley, I mean, I'm sure you have kind of gotten into these journalistic questions, but one of the things that I really came to believe was that to interview people, especially people, and it's not only Robert Carr and Son of Sam was another one, the infamous serial killer, and Bernie Madoff, and later on and most recently in my podcast series, The Burden, I spent another year trying to get to the infamous cop of our era, Detective Louis Scarcella. And, that took probably a year. And, I had to go to a Russian bath and allow him to beat me with oak leaves, which is not painful. And, we jumped into the freezing Atlantic. So there were a whole bunch of not only tests, but ways in which I wanted to become close to him. And one of the things that I promises I do make to people that I'm interviewing is I will really try to see the world through their eyes. And I do. And I think that a kind of not suspended disbelief, but empathy in which I try to see the world through their eyes is really important to journalism. We could talk about this for a long time because, there's the famous kind of Janet Malcolm trope, which is in their hearts, every journalist with any honesty about him or herself knows that they are a con man. And that became kind of famous. But I would add to that in my practice, sure, betrayal is at the heart of my journalism enterprise. But at the same time, I have a talent for sincerity. And I really think that I sincerely try to understand the person from his point of view. I think if you look at Bernie Madoff, my portrait of him is as a guy who explains his point of view, as a guy who, you get in and you understand what he feels he's dealing with, and it becomes a compassionate portrait. And I find, by the way, podcasting to be an extremely welcoming medium for this kind of intimacy, where you can really hear people talk, and quite literally, they can be in your ear.
When you were at New York Magazine, you were looking for the big stories all the time, the ones that could land on the front page or on the front of the magazine. Now in your life, doing podcasts and other things, I mean, what is it that gets your attention? Is it the same sort of instincts about a story that pulls you in and gives you that feeling like this could be a big project?
Listen, you and I met over a teenage con man that conned, among other people, other institutions, New York University, which is where you were at the time. And Bradley, by the way, was a prodigiously talented journalist at the age of 20, and really was, in working together with him, it was pretty fantastic to come upon somebody with his skills at that young age. And so, that was another story where I think we both really wanted to get close to him. And we did, and I did, and, interviewed this young con man and got into him in prison. And that was another instance where I did try and see the world through his eyes. I think it was a little more complicated because his hold on the world was a little bit more tenuous. But that kind of story was something that I really wanted to do for New York Magazine. I really wanted to do stories that went behind the headlines, that stories that, brought you intimately into the worlds of people who were being talked about. And a lot of times, they wrote off the headlines, and I know that's a kind of terrible, law and ordery kind of phrase, but I do think if you really achieve it, if you really get there, it's a fantastic way to understand the world and to offer readers or listeners that kind of involvement with what's going on in the world. I'll give one more example, which is that I got very inside the Murdoch family at one point, with interviews that were, sometimes disguised and sometimes not, of people inside the empire. And you got from that article an intense appreciation of the family dynamics. This is way before Succession, of what went on in that world. And for me, that was a huge score, because that was what I'm always looking for. So in podcasts, I'm looking to get behind the story, and I'm looking to be able to understand the kind of big headline, broadly told story as an intimate story of people, in some cases trying to do their best by their own lights, but in any case, kind of understanding the world in a particular way.
So your next big release is this director's cut of Empire on Blood. Maybe you can just walk us through a little bit what that project was all about, how it came about, and what's going to be new in this director's cut.
Empire on Blood was like a fantastic early experience with podcasting. I was inside this story, following it for 7 years. And part of that was while I was still a staff writer at New York Magazine. And frankly, I pitched this story to New York Magazine half a dozen ways, and I could never get them to listen to it, to kind of bite on it. And so luckily, it kind of entered the podcast world, and I suddenly was able to have a remarkable number of characters come alive on the microphone. And it kind of showed to me the kind of breadth and depth and theatrical and poetic qualities of the medium, because I had spent a lot of time trying to get to the bottom of one man's case, one man's plea that he had been wrongfully convicted. He'd been in prison for 20 years at the time that I happened onto this story. And he called me up from a prison payphone one day and just began a kind of screed about why he was innocent. And I'd written about people in prison enough to get calls like this and thick envelopes about this kind of thing over the years, and really had the inability to kind of choose which ones were worthy, and really didn't have the time. But Calvin Buari somehow kind of convinced me to take a look at his transcripts. And I read probably 1,000 pages of transcript of his trial, and I could not believe that this was an actual trial. Now, Calvin is a huge character. He goes back to the 90s in New York City, in the Bronx. It was overrun with crack, and Cal's one of the people who brought crack to the Bronx. He was a drug dealer. He was a bad dude. He strutted around in mink and had BMWs and really liked to live the life. And so he was not an immediately sympathetic character. But Cal insisted that he did not do these 2 murders that he was convicted of. And I took him seriously, and I took the proposition seriously. especially when I started to, first of all, I got familiar with his case, which plunged me into the criminal justice system. And all the characters started talking. So there's this private eye, this hard drinking private eye who's born again and carries a Bible and carries a gun and talks about how he lies to get the truth and becomes Cal's advocate in the world. And he and I actually tracked down, after 20 years, a woman who goes by the nickname Evelina because of her temper, who says she was a teenager sitting on the stoop and saw the murders, and nobody had ever heard from her. And there's a guy who goes by Father Frank, who's the detective on the case. Father Frank, because he gets the confessions, and he stands up because at one point someone else confesses to this murder, and he stands up and says, I knew it was all nonsense. And Father Frank goes and reverses the conviction. And then there's the prosecutor who also talks openly, and everybody talks for this, from their own point of view. And the prosecutor, who's another huge character, says to me, Cal was evil. He shot and killed lots of people. And so the prosecutor is absolutely convinced he's doing justice. And his motto, which he did not say, but was clear to me, was by any means necessary. And that's why this trial is so unfair. And by the way, this prosecutor's nickname is Turtle Man because he rescues turtles. And I went to his house and they roam free in his house. 20 turtles and tortoises roam free in his house. And one of them clomps down the stairs as I'm there talking to him. So the story that we're re-releasing as a director's cut, we call it that because we've added 3 new episodes, some of which are based on material that got left on the cutting room floor and that I really loved, and most of which is an update on these characters. And I don't want to spoil everything, so I'll just tell you about one, though. There's a character who's kind of a minor character in the initial episode, in the initial series, a guy named Emil, who's a jailhouse lawyer who helps the main character with his legal pursuits. And he is working furiously to get himself out of prison because he, too, says he was wrongfully convicted. He went to the precinct as a 17-year-old, and they arrested him that day, and he never went home. 17 when he was put in prison. He eventually is really pressured, coerced into taking a plea 19 years after he goes to prison. And the prosecutor says to him, we know you didn't do the murder, but we're sure you were involved. And we'll let you go home with time served, but you have to take a plea and admit to some crimes. And the prosecutor, in the process of negotiating this, says out loud, you can't let truth get in the way of justice sometimes. So I think we expose really how the justice system works, and we expose the dilemma that this guy Emil is put in front of, and how he is essentially pressured into taking a plea, which he does. He gets out of prison 4 days later in time for Christmas. And then 10 years later, 10 years after that, the Brooklyn district attorney, a new district attorney, comes in and agrees to reinvestigate Emil's case, which is really never done. And they sincerely reinvestigate this, spent thousands of dollars on it, and they find the real killer. He's a janitor in an elementary school. And I was told by the person who found him, she narrated how she sat down with him He's now a janitor at an elementary school. Sat down with him in a second grade classroom. So on those small chairs that make adults look like giants. And he broke down and said he'd carried this secret with him for 30 years and he had to get it off his chest. So Emil was not only had his conviction overturned, and we see a lot of that these days, but he was found actually innocent. And you never see that these days. So in Empire on Blood, we go back now and we follow the fate of some of our important characters in the world. And I think that listeners are going to find that really surprising. Father Frank is an episode and his fate completely turns on his head. Cal, our main character, is an episode and his fate absolutely turns on its head. Among other things, you can follow him on TV, and I won't say more.
Excellent. Well, one last question. I know, in addition to being a journalist, having had a brush with a serial killer, met Son of Sam, you also have a bar, right? Irv's? Maybe you could just explain how having a bar, how that came about, and how does it affect, or does it help you get some leads for your next big project?
Well, I happened into owning a bar. It was never like a life goal or a dream of mine, but I certainly embraced it. And the first bar was Irv's, named after Irv and Irv, my father. And it was 224 square feet, and a little cocktail bar on a dead-end street, which turned out to be a very violent street, which for some reason I didn't know when I started. And I will say that Emil has been there from Empire on Blood, and also in the latest, The Burden with Detective Scarcella. Detective Scarcella's being brought to the bar, and he actually patrolled the street on which the bar sat. And he said to me, "You're either out of your mind or you've got big cayunes," which apparently is Italian for cojones. But I will say that there was a dramatic, somewhat unhappy end to that bar. There was a murder there, putting the true in true crime. And so we closed that bar, and I've since opened another bar around the corner from it in a different micro neighborhood, which is called Ruth. It's in Brooklyn, and it's named after my mother. And I still like to bring journalists there. We sit in front of the fake fireplace, drink cocktails, and talk about the past and the future.
Sounds like you should have a live episode of a podcast there. Would be good,
I've thought of it. Yeah.
Well, thank you so much, Steve. It's been a pleasure to have you on the show.
Thanks for having me, Bradley. It's been great.
That's it for this week. Thank you to Steve for joining us. You can find My Friend the Serial Killer wherever you listen to podcasts. If you're enjoying whale hunting, please go online, check out our website, and subscribe, whalehunting.projectbrazen.com. Thanks for listening. We'll be back next week for more.
That's it for this week, and thanks for listening. The best way to stay up to date with whale hunting is to hit follow wherever you listen to podcasts. And you can also subscribe to the Whale Hunting newsletter for updates on the shadowy lives of the powerful and ultra-wealthy at whalehunting.projectbrazen.com. That's whalehunting.projectbrazen.com. Whale Hunting is a production of Project Brazen. It's hosted by me, Tom Wright, and Bradley Hope. It's produced by Megan Dean and Claire Urban. At Project Brazen, Mariangel Gonzalez is our project manager. Ryan Ho is the creative director, with additional design from Andrea Claridge.